And today, we are very honored to invite Professor Eric Watkins from UC San Diego to give us actually a lecture series today and Saturday, 2 lectures. Let me first introduce Professor Watkins a while. Professor Watkins is world's famous Kant scholar and a UC distinguished professor. He received a PhD from Notre Dame University under the supervision of the famous Kant scholar Karl Emmerich. And then he taught at Virginia State University, Yale University, and finally UC San Diego. And he published 2 monographs, one in 2005, Kant and the Metaphysics of Plurality, and which is the most comprehensive and in-depth study on this theme in many years. And recently, in 2019, he published another book, Kant on the Laws. He also, the first book, Kant and the Metaphysics of Plurality, has received important prize from the prominent academic journal, namely Journal of the History of Philosophy. In addition to these books, he also edited and translated many things from Kant. For example, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Background Source Materials, and Kant Nature Science. He also edited several distinguished research on Kant and also published several dozens of research papers. Professor Watkins has been a Humboldt scholar in Germany, and he has received many important awards, such as the Distinguished Teaching Award from UC San Diego, and he served as a vice president of North American Kant Society for a long time. And today, the topic will be Kant on the Unconditioned. So please join me to warmly welcome Professor Watkins for the talk.
Thank you so much for the generous invitation and the very flattering introduction. That was very kind of you. I'm going to share my screen. Oops, I need to actually, I think you need to make it possible for me to.
Okay, 你先那个把它那个让它共享屏幕。
So I take it that at least some people had the opportunity to read the paper in advance, but maybe not everybody did. And so I want to share my screen so that you can both listen to me and read. And also, if I talk too fast, somebody needs to tell me to slow down. I'm happy to slow down, but I will forget. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. Here we go. Okay. So can people see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and begin. In the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant makes it clear that his philosophical project in that work is motivated by the endless controversies that surround traditional metaphysics. Though metaphysics was once called the queen of the sciences due to persistent disagreements about its most basic claims and arguments, it is now despised on all sides. Indeed, given the intractable debate among his predecessors, he asks whether metaphysics is even possible. To answer this question, throughout the course of the first critique, Kant undertakes an extensive analysis of our cognitive faculties, concluding that we cannot establish the core claims of traditional metaphysics, because while our faculties suffice to cognize appearances, they're unable to generate theoretical cognition of the objects of traditional metaphysics. All is not lost, however, since he maintains that practical grounds are sufficient to warrant what he calls belief in the most important of these objects, though he does not provide a detailed account of the nature of these grounds until the publication of the Critique of Practical Reason. One question that is absolutely central to Kant's project in the first critique thus concerns the justification of his claim that we cannot have theoretical cognition of the objects of traditional metaphysics. Why can we not cognize the soul, the world as a totality, including freedom, and God's existence? Though Kant's answer is complex, its basic structure has two parts. First, the objects of traditional metaphysics cannot be cognized in the same way that empirical objects can, because they cannot be given immediately in intuition and are not objects of possible experience. Second, the objects of traditional metaphysics also cannot be cognized by way of rational inference, since the arguments that have been advanced that attempt to derive these claims from other cognitions are all fallacious. Kant develops this account in the Transcendental Dialectic by analyzing the nature of reason and how its ability to draw inferences might be thought to be able to extend our cognition beyond what sensibility and the understanding can accomplish on their own. The argument of the Transcendental Dialectic is thus clearly an essential part of his overall case against the claims of traditional metaphysics. For one cannot simply assume without argument that reason cannot be an independent source of cognition, especially when Kant's predecessors presented detailed arguments for their claims about the nature of the soul, the existence of God, and so on. To this end, Kant proposes a general principle in the dialectic that he thinks is a central presupposition of their arguments. And he suggests that paying proper attention to this principle will allow us to see where their arguments go astray and help us to discern, if not eliminate, the transcendental illusion that tempts us into accepting their fallacious arguments. Kant formulates this principle in slightly different ways depending on context. But one formulation, which occurs prominently in the introduction to the dialectic, reads, and I quote, "When the conditioned is given, then so is the whole series of conditions subordinated one to the other, which is itself unconditioned, also given," end quote. Setting aside for now important exegetical questions, one can interpret this formulation as asserting the following principle. And this principle P, if the conditioned exists, then all of its conditions, and thus the unconditioned, also exist. That is, reason seems to be committed to the idea that if the conditioned exists, then all of its conditions exist. And if all of its conditions exist, then something unconditioned exists as well. The standard view incorporates this principle into Kant's criticism of traditional metaphysics along the following lines. First, as a purely historical matter, Kant interprets this principle as central to the arguments of his predecessors. For he identifies certain entities as conditioned, he invokes a version of P as a crucial premise in his reconstructions of their arguments, and he characterizes the objects of traditional metaphysics, such as God, the soul, and freedom, as unconditioned, before then asserting the existence of these unconditioned entities in a statement of the conclusions of their arguments. Second, though principle P may have some immediate intuitive appeal, Kant can seem to question whether it could ever be justified. In the passage that immediately follows, the one from the introduction to the dialectic quoted above, Kant claims that the, quote, is obviously synthetic, for the conditioned is analytically related to some condition, but not to the unconditioned, end quote. And if it is synthetic, then it cannot be established solely on the basis of an analysis of concepts. But if, as Kant repeatedly asserts, the unconditioned cannot be an appearance, then one also cannot appeal to intuition to justify the apparently synthetic connection P asserts between the conditioned and the unconditioned. Though P cannot be justified by either analysis or intuition, one might attempt to derive it instead from a closely related, purely logical principle that Kant states just prior to his formulation of P. An analysis of that argument reveals, however, that its basic inference is illegitimate. All of this can naturally lead one to conclude that P cannot be justified at all, which would then call into question any argument that employs it as a premise. Third, this view of principle P can seem to receive further support when Kant claims that principle P is not true of appearances. In the 7th section of the antinomy of pure reason, the critical decision of the cosmological conflict of reason with itself, Kant notes, if I am dealing with appearances, then I cannot say that if the condition is given, then all of the conditions as appearances for it are also given. And hence I can by no means infer the absolute totality of the series of these conditions, end quote. Kant can seem to be saying here that principle P does not apply to appearances, in which case it follows that P is false, given that there is a class of objects, namely appearances, to which it does not apply. However, if principle P is not only unjustified, but also false, then any argument that assumes it cannot be sound. And it would be natural to think that, given the prominence Kant attaches to it, its falsity would be the ultimate source of his criticism of the claims of traditional metaphysics. As a result, it can seem that the difficulties that traditional metaphysics encounters derive from reason's acceptance of this principle, and that Kant is correct to criticize those traditional metaphysicians who use it as a load-bearing premise in their arguments. Indeed, on this picture, Kant's most fundamental point in the dialectic is precisely to warn us not to be deceived into accepting principle P. In this paper, I argue for a radically different picture. On my view, when principle P is properly specified, Kant accepts it. And when it is properly understood, he thinks that it is both justified and true. And all this is the case despite its synthetic character and despite his claim that the principle is false when applied to appearances. In a first section, I clarify several of its most central concepts and distinguish three different versions of P. In a second section, I reconstruct and defend an argument for one of these three versions of P. In a third section, I consider the passage from A 498, 499, B 527 in detail, distinguishing two ways in which P can be applied to appearances, and showing that the falsity of one specification of P does not threaten P itself, and that Kant's assertion of the truth of another specification ends up providing support for the argument for P presented in the second section. I conclude by offering two reasons Kant could still have for thinking that the claims of traditional metaphysics are mistaken if the errors are not attributable to the falsity of P. Now I'm turning to the first section. Am I reading both loudly enough and slowly enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. So 3 concepts and 3 versions of principle P. 3 concepts that occupy pride of place in principle P are those of the conditioned, that of the conditioned, and that of the unconditioned. As was clear from the second passage from the introduction to the dialectic quoted in the introduction to this paper, Kant notes that there is an analytic relation between the concept conditioned and the concept condition. It's also obvious that there's a conceptual relation between the concept conditioned and the concept unconditioned, in the trivial sense that whatever is unconditioned is, by definition, not conditioned. So attaining clarity about any one of these concepts promises to help us to become clearer about the other 2. Unfortunately, Kant nowhere provides a clear definition of these concepts. As a result, it is necessary to piece together an account from his various uses. One point that is immediately clear is that since these concepts are all relational, there must also be a concept of a specific kind of relation that obtains between the conditioned and its conditions, which I will call a conditioning relation. The idea is that if something is conditioned, then there must also be a condition that conditions it. That is, there must be a conditioning relation that the condition stands in to the conditioned. Otherwise, it would not be conditioned. Similarly, if something is a condition, there must be something that it conditions. That is, something to which it stands in a conditioning relation. Otherwise, it would not be a condition. So in addition to the notions of a condition and the conditioned, there is that of a conditioning relation. It's useful to start by becoming clear about the notion of a conditioning relation, and then to use that notion to clarify the others. In line with his general distinction between the logical and the real, Kant makes use of both logical and real conditioning relations. Logical conditioning relations obtain between the premises and the conclusion of a syllogism, where the truth of the conclusion depends on and is explained by the truth of the premises and the logical relations between them. Logical conditioning relations, logical conditioning relations are thus explanatory relations of logical dependence among cognitions. Analogously, real conditioning relations obtain between entities or objects broadly construed, where the entity that is conditioned depends on and is explained by those entities that are its conditions and the real relations that obtain between them. Real conditioning relations are thus explanatory relations of metaphysical dependence among entities. For example, Kant thinks of composition as a real conditioning relation, since a real whole depends on and is explained by the parts that compose it and dependence relations that obtain between them. Given these 2 uses, the logical and the real, the general notion of a conditioning relation can be defined in terms of explanatory relations of dependence. We can now turn to the notions of the conditioned and its condition. It follows from the account of real conditioning relations just provided that the conditioned is an entity that depends on something for its existence and that stands in need of explanation. It also follows that a condition is an entity on which the conditioned entity depends for its existence, and that explains something about the conditioned entity that stands in need of explanation. So to continue with our example of composition, a real whole is conditioned because it depends on and is explained by its parts, while the parts are the conditions of the whole because they, along with the relations they stand in, are that on which it depends and that explain it. Kant identifies a number of different kinds of conditioning relations, and thus also a number of different kinds of conditions and conditioned entities. For example, he thinks of causal relations as one kind of conditioning relation, where the cause is a causal condition and the effect is the causally conditioned entity, a relation that is distinct from the composition relation, given that parts are not causes of the whole they compose. Representation or thought is a mental conditioning relation because representations depend on an I that thinks them, or the I think that must be able to accompany them. And the I's act of thinking, or the spontaneous act that produces the I think, explains the existence of its representations. For similar reasons, it is distinct from both composition and causation. Kant identifies a number of other cases that are systematically important to his project, but need not concern us here. It's enough that these different relations are all particular instances of a more general kind of conditioning relation, which is expressed in Principle P. Given these clarifications, we can now explain the meaning of the notion of the unconditioned, as well as why it appears in Principle P as a principle of pure reason. In one respect, this issue is straightforward. An entity is unconditioned simply if it has no conditions. That is, if it does not depend for its existence on something and does not stand in need of explanation. However, in the context of Principle P, and in line with the interests of traditional metaphysicians, Kant has in mind only those unconditioned entities that are also the conditions of something unconditioned. In short, according to Kant, reason is focused on unconditioned conditions rather than simply on the unconditioned per se. And the point of this is clear. Reason, on Kant's analysis, is interested not only in what itself needs no explanation, but also in whatever stands in need of explanation and in whatever it is that explains that. As a result, reason is interested in explanations that are complete, both in the sense that no further explanation is possible in terms of further conditions, and in the sense that what initially stood in need of explanation has in fact been explained by the relevant conditions. So Principle P gives expression to reason's interest insofar as it states that there must be a complete explanation, for example, an unconditioned condition, of that which stands in need of explanation, namely the conditions. As the antinomial structure of the antinomies makes clear, Kant thinks that the unconditioned can be realized in two different ways. In one case, typically represented by the thesis option, the unconditioned is the terminal member of a series of conditions, where each of the non-terminal members is a condition that is itself conditioned by a prior member of the series. Simple parts, that is, parts not composed of further parts, are an instance of this kind of unconditioned entity, insofar as they are the terminal members in the series of parts that compose a given real whole. However, as is clear from the antithesis option, Kant accepts that an infinite series of conditions, that is, a series that does not have a terminal member, is also unconditioned. In this case, even though every member of the series is conditioned, the series is unconditioned in the sense that there is no entity outside of the series that conditions any member within the series. For that reason, an explanation of something conditioned in terms of an infinite series of conditions can be complete, not in the sense that there is a terminal member of the series, nor in the sense that one can necessarily complete the process of going through all its members, but rather in the sense that there are no further conditions outside the series that would explain what is conditioned, and also in the sense that each conditioned entity is explained by the prior members of the series. This sense of the term unconditioned is common to series that have and that fail to have terminal members, and is the sense that is relevant to reason's interests. Before turning to possible justifications of principle P, we need to return to one interpretive matter that was set aside above. P refers to all of the conditions of the conditioned entity that exists, but the quotation that P was drawn from refers to the whole series of its conditions. Elsewhere, Kant uses yet other phrases, referring, for example, to the whole sum of conditions, to the unlimited completeness in the series of conditions, and the totality of conditions. If these phrases have different meanings, then there could be different versions of principle P. To clarify the relevant versions of P, consider three different principles that concern the existence of the conditions for some conditioned entity. All. If any of its conditions exist, then all of its conditions exist. Totality. If any of its conditions exist, then one can consider all of its conditions together as a totality. And then finally, set. If any of its conditions exist, then the set of all of its conditions exists. Given these three principles, one can specify three different versions of principle P. First, P all. If the conditioned exists, then all of its conditions, and thus the unconditioned, also exist. That was the original formulation of P that I provided at the beginning of the paper. P totality says, if the conditioned exists, then one can consider all of its conditions together as a totality, and thus the unconditioned also exists. And then finally, P set. If the conditioned exists, then the set of all its conditions, and thus the unconditioned, also exists. Given these different versions of P, the question is whether any of them can be justified. And it's to this question that we now turn. Though Kant does not formulate an argument for principle P in a single passage that is explicitly devoted to that purpose, one can identify two passages that give expression to two distinct parts of a justification of some version of principle P. The first occurs in the first section of the antinomy of pure reason, and I quote, "Reason demands this in accordance with the principle. If the conditioned is given, then the whole sum of conditions, and hence the absolutely unconditioned, is also given, through which alone the conditioned was possible." That's from A 409, B 436. One thought Kant is expressing here is that the conditioned is possible only through the whole sum of its conditions, because the conditioned is an entity that depends for its existence on its conditions, and thus exists only if they do. By focusing on the notion of dependence that conditioning relations contain, it argues in favor of the existence of the sum of all the conditions of what is conditioned. The second passage occurs in a footnote later in the same section. It reads, quote, "The absolute whole of the series of conditions for a given condition is always unconditioned, because outside it, there are no more conditions regarding which it could be conditioned," end quote. So its basic idea is that insofar as the absolute whole of the conditions of some conditioned entity exists, there can be no additional conditions for that conditioned entity, because any additional condition would have to already be contained in the initial whole. But whatever has no conditions is by definition unconditioned. By focusing on the idea that all the conditions exist if the conditioned exists, this passage argues in favor of the existence of something unconditioned, that is, the condition of whatever is conditioned. Taken together, these passages suggest the following general sketch of an argument for principle P. Take any entity, X, which is conditioned in some respect. Given the meaning of the concept conditioned, its notion of metaphysical dependence in particular, there must be one or more entities that condition X in that respect. Otherwise, X would not be conditioned. Now let Y be all the entities that condition X in that respect, whether they be finite or infinite in number. It follows that Y must be unconditioned. Or suppose, for the sake of a reductio, that Y is conditioned in the relevant respects. If Y is conditioned in that respect, then, given the meaning of conditioned, including its irreflexivity, there must be some Z not identical to Y that conditions it in that respect. Since conditioning relations are transitive, if Z conditions Y by the reductio's original assumption, and if Y conditions X, since X is conditioned, then Z conditions X. But then, contrary to the definition of Y, Y did not contain all of the conditions of X. Therefore, Y cannot be conditioned, but rather must be unconditioned, which entails that something unconditioned exists. It's useful to divide this argument into three steps. The first step infers from the existence of something conditioned to the existence of at least one condition. The second step infers to the existence of the whole sum or absolute whole of its conditions, while the third step infers from the existence of such a whole to the existence of the unconditioned. The first step, which is the same for all three versions of principle P, it seems, at least at first blush, to be an analytic truth. As we saw in the passage quoted above, Kant states explicitly that the conditioned is analytically related to its conditions. And that claim is uncontroversial insofar as, given the notion of metaphysical dependence that is involved in the notion of the conditioned, the existence of the conditioned does entail the existence of at least one condition. For it is certainly true that if something conditioned exists, then at least one entity exists that is its condition, since if it didn't, the conditioned entity would not be conditioned, which is a contradiction. The second and third steps are more complicated insofar as the different versions of principle P are based on different interpretations of what the phrases the whole sum or absolute whole mean. As a result, they take different paths to the existence of the unconditioned and thus require different reconstructions of these steps. For reasons of time, I'm going to set aside the arguments for P set and P totality, which I grant are fallacious. They're bad arguments. Instead, I want to focus immediately on P all. By interpreting the phrase the whole sum of conditions simply as all of the conditions, P all infers from the existence of something conditioned to the existence of all of its conditions. The argument proceeds as follows, and this should sound familiar given what I said before. Assume the existence of some conditioned entity X. For each and every entity that exists, either that entity conditions X or it doesn't. If it conditions X, then it is one of X's conditions. If it does not, then it is not one of X's conditions. The first step has already established that at least one condition of X exists. But if exactly one entity conditions X, and therefore exactly one condition of X exists, then all of the conditions of X exist. Similarly, if exactly two entities condition X, and therefore exactly two conditions of X exist, then all of its conditions exist. The point generalizes. However many entities condition X, and thus however many conditions of X there are, whether they are finite or infinite in number, all of them exist. For given all the entities that exist and all the conditioning relations that they stand into X, it follows that all the conditions for X exist, because all the conditioning relations that all the existing entities stand into X determine what all the conditions are for X. Therefore, if at least one condition of X exists, which the first step has established, then all of its conditions exist. The argument for the second step is thus in good order. P-all's third step, which infers from the existence of all the conditions to the existence of the unconditioned, can be justified on the basis of the following idea. Note that the series of all the conditions for something conditioned is either finite, in which case it has at least one terminal member, or is infinite, in which case it has no terminal member. If there is a terminal member, then that member is itself unconditioned, and thus something unconditioned exists. If there is no terminal member, then no condition is unconditioned in the sense that it has no conditions at all, but it is still true that none of these conditions are conditioned by anything that is not a member of the series. And for that reason, they are unconditioned in that sense. So regardless of how many conditions exist, something unconditioned exists, just as P-all's third step asserts. As a result, we've reached our desired conclusion. P-all's first step is, if not an analytic truth, still certainly true. What's more, we've now seen that the second and third steps have clear philosophical support. So P-all seems to be fully justified. I'm going to skip the next paragraph on the basis of time. We can now conclude, we can now conclude that all the three steps that constitute the argument for P-all are defensible, and thus that the argument for P-all is sound. Given the subtle distinctions between the different versions of P, it's understandable that the complications that P totality face and the troubles that affect the argument for P set could have led some to claim that Kant rejects P, and to infer that P is the source of the faulty claims of traditional metaphysics. But now we can see that such a view is mistaken, for P-all is in fact justified. It gives expression to reason's interest by asserting that there is a complete explanation for whatever stands in need of explanation, because all the conditions make possible whatever is conditioned, and thus something unconditioned exists. I just want to check in right now about time, because I've got to make a decision. Either I skip the next 4 pages and go straight to the conclusion, which is a few pages, or I read the next 4 pages before I get to the conclusion. Maybe, Jing, you can help me make that decision?
And I think we have time to read the 4 pages and then for discussion.
Okay, all right. Okay, good. So, oops. So section 4, specifications of P all. Recall that one reason for resisting principle P derives from the claim that it cannot be justified either by intuition or conceptual analysis. The previous section has argued that although the arguments for P totality and P set are not compelling, there is a defensible argument for P. So the one reason for worrying about P is that you might think it's not justified, but we just saw there is a justification. In the introduction, I noted a second reason for resisting P, one that derived from a passage, from section 7 of the antinomy of pure reason. There, Kant suggested that P all is false for appearances, which can seem to entail, in turn, that P all is false as a general principle. To see whether this reason for rejecting P all is compelling, it's important to understand exactly what Kant is claiming. Here's the fuller passage. On the contrary, if I'm dealing with appearances, which as mere representations are not given at all if I do not achieve acquaintance with them, that is, to them themselves, for they are nothing except empirical cognitions, then I cannot say with the same meaning that if the condition is given, then all the conditions as appearances for it are also given. And hence I can by no means infer the absolute totality of the series of these conditions. For the appearances in their apprehension are themselves nothing other than an empirical synthesis in space and time, and thus are given only in this synthesis. Now, this is a rich passage, one that appeals to several of Kant's distinctive doctrines concerning appearances, synthesis, givenness, among others. Note that the view Kant is explicitly denying in this passage is not P all, but rather a restricted version of P all that applies to appearances as follows. I'm going to call this P all app. And it says, if a conditioned appearance exists, then all of its conditions exist as appearances, and thus the unconditioned also exists as an appearance. Now, as we've seen, Kant rejects the idea that the unconditioned could be an appearance that would be given an intuition, and thus would reject P all app on those grounds alone. However, in the passage just quoted, Kant also explicitly rejects the first part of P all app. Namely, he rejects the idea that all of the conditions of the conditioned appearance exist as appearances. Since, as the quote makes clear, appearances depend on a synthesis, and a synthesis that produces any one appearance does not automatically entail a synthesis that produces any other appearance, the existence of one appearance, for example, the conditioned, does not entail the existence of another appearance, namely that of one of its conditions. Indeed, Kant's objection here is fully justified. The fact that an appearance is given an intuition does not entail that all the conditions of that appearance must also be given. P all app is thus false, just as Kant claims in that passage. However, and this is the crucial point, does the falsity of P all app entail the falsity of P all? Clearly not. If we keep in mind how the argument for P all proceeds and apply it to appearances, we can see that what the argument supporting P all entails is only that for a given appearance that is conditioned, all its conditions, and thus the unconditioned, too exist. But these considerations do not entail that all the conditions must be appearances. One can leave open the question of whether its conditions are appearances or things themselves or a mix thereof. There is simply no reason to restrict all the conditions and the unconditioned to appearances, as P all app does. Indeed, on Kant's view, it is arguably necessary, at least in some cases, that at least one of an appearance's conditions must be a thing in itself. For example, if my action here and now is free, then it is causally conditioned both by a series of previous events and by a transcendentally free action. In such a case, the causal conditions of my action will include both appearances, the empirical causes of my action, and a thing in itself, that is, a transcendentally free, that is, uncaused cause of my action. This is a clear counterexample to P all app, but it does not at all call P all into question. Given this line of reasoning, it might seem that one ought to reject a similarly restricted version of P all, where the restriction is to things in themselves rather than appearances. That is, by reason of parity, it seems that Kant ought to reject the following principle, which I'm going to call P all things in themselves. And it says, if a conditioned thing in itself exists, then all of its conditions exist as things in themselves, and thus the unconditioned also exists as a thing in itself. However, in the passage that immediately precedes the previous quotation, Kant asserts the following, I quote, "Further, if the conditioned as well as its condition are things in themselves, then when the first is given, the latter is thereby really already given along with it. And because this holds for all members of the series, then the complete series of conditions, and hence the unconditioned, is thereby simultaneously given, or rather it is presupposed by the fact that the condition, which is possible only through that series, is given." End quote. This is a remarkable passage for several reasons. First, in it, Kant is clearly and unambiguously affirming P all things in themselves. How can this be if he rejects P all app? Well, Kant's differential treatment derives, I suggest, from the following asymmetry. Things in themselves can be the conditions of appearances, but appearances cannot be the conditions of things in themselves. The first point explains why the conditions of a conditioned appearance need not be appearances, whereas the second entails that since all the conditions of a conditioned thing in itself cannot be appearances, they must be things in themselves, just as P all things in themselves asserts. Second, and even more importantly, the passage presents clear support for P all. Despite Kant's claim that we cannot have theoretical cognition of things in themselves, P all things in themselves is clearly a principle that holds for things in themselves. While one might think that Kant's prohibition on cognition of things in themselves need not preclude analytic truths, it is not clear that this principle is an analytic truth. Instead, it seems to give expression to precisely the kind of argument that we reconstructed for P all in the previous section. If the conditioned exists, then the conditions that make it possible also exist. But because this is true for all of its conditions, the unconditioned also exists. The same argument that works for conditioned entities in general works for this particular class of entities, namely things in themselves, where the restriction is justified in this case, but not in others, because appearances cannot be conditions of things in themselves. But given that Kant not only accepts P all things in themselves, but does so for the very same reasons that support P all, this passage provides further support for the view that Kant accepts P all. The point is perhaps clearer if put negatively. If Kant were to reject P all, he would clearly also have to reject P all things in themselves. But since, as this passage makes clear, he does not reject the latter, he must be committed to the former on pains of inconsistency. By considering several passages from section 7 of the Antinomy of Pure Reason, which promises, quote, a critical decision of the cosmological conflict of reason with itself, quote, we have seen that Kant does not think that appearances render P all false. But once one has distinguished different restricted versions of P all for appearances and things themselves, one can see that Kant is right to reject the version that is restricted to appearances, namely P all app, because appearances can be conditioned by entities that are not appearances. One can also see that Kant is right to accept the version that is restricted to things in themselves, namely P all things in themselves, both because appearances cannot condition things in themselves and because the same argument that supports P all supports this restricted version. Thus, instead of this passage being a threat to P all, it ends up speaking strongly in its favor. Okay, now we get to the conclusion. It's a bit long as conclusions go, but not so long. If P all can be justified in this way, and if we therefore have reason to accept it as true, then the standard view's account of Kant's rejection of the claims of traditional metaphysics can no longer be accepted. If P all shows that it is legitimate to infer from the existence of something conditioned to the existence of something unconditioned, then why should we think that the claims of traditional metaphysics are false, according to Kant? A satisfying answer to this question would require a detailed analysis of Kant's complex argument in the dialectic, a task that exceeds what is possible right now. However, even prior to such an analysis, one can appreciate two reasons for thinking that the claims of traditional metaphysics are problematic. The first can be seen by recalling the difference noted above between the generic notion of a real conditioning relation and the various specific kinds of real conditioning relations. I didn't go into it in much detail, but composition is one kind of conditioning relation. Causation is a different kind of real conditioning relation. Representation or thinking is a different kind. So these are all different kinds of real conditioning relations. So P all employs a generic notion of real conditioning relations and posits only the existence of something unconditioned in general. It does not specify any positive, for example, intrinsic feature of the unconditioned entity that would allow us to identify it or distinguish it from others. For example, it does not specify that the unconditioned must be God, a simple, or freedom, nor does it identify the entities that would be unconditioned. Instead, Kant refers to it as an indeterminate something. To be able to draw a conclusion about the existence of the particular objects of traditional metaphysics, one would need an argument that appeals to a specific kind of conditioning relation. So composition, causation, representation, and so on. And that can, as a result, allow an inference to the existence of an entity that has more specific properties. For example, it has all realities, it lacks any parts, etc. In short, showing that something exists that is unconditioned is one thing. Showing that God, freedom, and simples exist is another. And such a task is neither trivial nor easy. In the case of compositional and causal conditioning relations, for example, one would have to rule out the possibility that the series of these conditions is infinite. And one would also have to specify what things are unconditioned. Thus, even if P all is both justified and true, as I've argued, there is still a significant gap between the existence of something unconditioned and the existence of the specific objects of traditional metaphysics. One can, I suggest, take the upshot of Kant's analysis in the dialectic to be that those arguments of his predecessors that would fill this gap cannot, in fact, accomplish what they would need to, and their claims are, for that reason, mistaken. A second reason for rejecting the claims of traditional metaphysics, even if one accepts P. all, derives from the fact that Kant interprets the claims of traditional metaphysics as assertions of synthetic a priori cognition, formulating his main question in the first critique in the Prolegomena as, is metaphysics possible as a science, that is, as a body of synthetic a priori cognition? That is, Kant takes the claims of traditional metaphysics to be claims to cognition, and they would, for that reason, have to satisfy the conditions of cognition. According to this line of thought, the problem with traditional metaphysics is neither that unconditioned entities do not exist, nor that there is no explanation for that which stands in need of explanation. In fact, because God is because Kant is committed to God's existence, the soul's immortality, and human freedom on practical grounds, the problem cannot be that these claims are false. Instead, the problem is that we fail to have theoretical cognition of the unconditioned, and therefore cannot have the kind of cognitive grasp of such metaphysically fundamental entities that would satisfy theoretical reason. We may well have our ideas of what the unconditioned entities might be like, ideas of God, freedom, and immortality, but, so Kant's charge, without cognition, these ideas are just figments of our brain or empty thoughts that do not latch onto reality. What's more, it would be a mistake to attempt to deploy P. all to justify the claims of traditional metaphysics as claims to cognition. For though it might be tempting to think otherwise, P. all is not closed under known entailment for cognition. So in other words, from the fact that I cognize something conditioned, it does not follow that I can therefore cognize its conditions, even if P. all entails that its conditions exist. For the fact that a conditioned entity is given to me in intuition does not entail that its conditions are given to me in intuition as well, even if it does follow that I should seek cognition of those conditions. For that reason, it would be a mistake to attempt to use P. all to infer from the cognition of conditioned entities that we have to cognition of the unconditioned entities that condition them. If this diagnosis is correct, then what Kant is objecting to about traditional metaphysics is not that their claims cannot be true, but rather that the arguments offered in support of them must be inadequate because they are insufficiently specific along two dimensions. The first is that P. all is too generic to entail specific conclusions. And the second is that attempting to make these arguments more specific by using P. all to infer to cognition of the unconditioned fails because P. all cannot be used to infer to cognition of the unconditioned and thus cannot specify any particular features of the unconditioned. What's more, taking P. all to be a true principle rather than the source of illusions of metaphysics reveals a rather different picture of Kant's project and commitments than the standard view maintains. Instead of thinking that Kant views reason as a fundamentally illusory faculty that leads us astray, once we see that Kant accepts P. all, we can see that, on his account, reason takes the world to be fully intelligible, even if it isn't. We can see that there is a complete explanation of whatever it is that stands in need of explanation, but that given the limitations of our cognitive faculties, we can never cognize reality completely. And instead of thinking that reason is a faculty that we would be better off without by leading us to make claims we can never vindicate, we should view reason as the source of regulative principles that help us come ever closer to a complete explanation of the world. So thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you, Professor Watkins, for very interesting and informative talk. Now we can have some Q&A. And if any,
Hi, Eric. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. I really enjoy it pretty much. I'm just like to ask you a clarification problem.
Sure.
Because Kant, in the first critique, has the three concepts for the category of relation, right? Substantial relation, causal relation, community. I'm just wondering whether we could put these three kinds of relation into the P principle as what you suggested in this paper, right? You see, okay, there's a P principle, then we talk about the conditioned, conditions, unconditioned, and then think about the dependence relation. But dependence relation, whether that really captures those three sorts of relations at all, or we have to make a kind of specification for these relations.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the way that the text works, as I understand it, is that at the beginning of the transcendental dialectic, Kant states this principle as the principle for all of pure reason. And then he asks, is this a legitimate principle or not? And at that point, his question is, I don't know, we'll have to see. And so what he then does is he looks at, in the paralogisms and the antinomy of pure reason and the ideal, he looks at the different specific conditioned entities that he finds in the world and thinks about the arguments that would be that you can formulate given those conditioned entities, such that the conclusions are specific conditioned entities, are the specific conditions for those conditioned entities that we experience. There's a sense in which Kant thinks, he says different things about this, but I take it, for example, that in the ideal of pure reason, where Kant is concerned with explaining the possibility of all things, and he seems to want to say that there must be one thing that is the ground of all possibility. That's plausible in part because it looks like all the possibilities are sort of relative to each other. And so you can't specify one possibility without specifying all the possibilities. And so that is probably best understood as a real causal relation that would be expressed by way of the category of mutual interaction. Okay. Here's another case where I think this is applicable. If you think about space, right? Kant thinks that the different regions of space symmetrically depend on each other, but they also depend on space itself, right? So again, this seems like their coordination of the different regions of space depends on all of space, which is prior to the different regions of space. And so I'm happy to say that Kant will look for different kinds of conditioning relations in different cases. So for example, in the first paralogism too, Kant is interested in how it is that a substance is a condition of its accidents, right? So that would be the first category under the heading of relation. And then I've already given you a couple examples of the third category of a relation. And then the causal conditional relation is an obvious case of the second. So yes, P all is going to need to be specified for the particular real conditioning relations that we encounter, however it is that we encounter them. Is that clarifying your question?
Oh, yes, pretty much. I might just quickly follow up. Because when we talk about this mutual interaction, as you said, you think about the items within the whole, right? They coordinate against or with each other. But the problem is whether we could think about this items, the members, components as a kind of moments, which at the same time to have a mutual interaction with the whole itself. And in this case, it seems very hard to find the unconditioned, right? Because both of them actually interact against each other.
Right. That's why I think that the third category is always super complicated. And I think that what I was trying to illustrate a little bit with the example of space is, let's say we've got region 1 of space and region 2 of space. They're right next to each other. And so each one sort of limits the other, right? And they do that symmetrically. What Kant wants to say is that they can mutually limit each other only because they're parts of the one all-encompassing space. And so the way I understand that is that Kant is saying that they can reciprocally condition each other only because both are conditioned by space as a whole. That's how that's possible. Does that?
So you think there's no way for Kant to see there's a kind of bilateral rather than the unilateral relation for these conditional relations, right? The dependence. So the condition always depends on the unconditioned rather than the unconditioned at the same time. It also depends on conditions.
Well, I don't want to say that the unconditioned depends on the conditions, right? Because then it wouldn't be unconditioned.
Yeah.
So what I want to say is space is the condition on regions of space. And in fact, it's a condition on the regions of space conditioning each other. And so space is the unconditioned, and what is conditioned are the regions in space. And what conditions each region of space is the other region of space and space itself.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going by, so what one would need would be a sort of detailed explanation of all the different kinds of real conditioning relations. I will note that Marcus Villacek has a very nice discussion of this topic in Kant and the Sources of Metaphysics. I wouldn't say that he lays everything out, but he does sort of go into how it is that real conditioning relations at least fall into 3 different classes, according to the 3 different classes of the relational categories. But he doesn't go on to explain how that works, for example, for space and the regions in space. So there's more work to be done.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, a follow-up question. So it seems that Kant suggests there is a single chain in each kind of condition. For example, the cause and the effect and cause of the cause and to the unconditioned and then to freedom. But when, as you just illustrate with the case of space, it seems that as you suggested, a space is both conditioned by a region of the space, be both conditioned by another region of the space, and also by the space, the all-encompassing space as a whole. So it seems in this case there is not a single chain of dependence or condition. So that's the problem.
Good. Yeah, no, great. So again, so I think there's a danger, and in this paper I may have presented things as if I was falling into the danger of trying to do all this sort of top down. Let's just think about condition and conditioning relations and try and derive everything on the basis of that. That's actually the direct opposite of what my normal approach is, which is to start with some specific case and then see if we can make sense of that. And so in the case that you mentioned, namely causal conditioning, there I think that it's not a case of sort of one condition to conditioned, right? So for example, for any given event, there could be lots of different conditions. And for those conditions, there can be lots of further conditions. In some ways, it of course could be like the case of composition, right? So if I have my pen is composed of lots of different parts. And in fact, the parts are also composed of parts. And so there's an infinite number of at least potentially infinite number of parts for that pen. Of course, it can also go for causation, it can of course also go the other direction, which is that you might have one event that causes lots of conditioned effects, right? I mean, think of the Big Bang. There's just this, who knows what the state of the world is in the Big Bang, but there's just this one thing, and then it explodes, and then you get lots and lots and lots of matter spread out throughout space-time. So there you've got one causal condition giving rise to lots of different conditioned entities. But it can go the other way. You can have one conditioned event that's caused by lots of different effects. So I think you just have to look at the particular cases and see see what kind of conditioning relation it is. Maybe it's the subordinated kind of conditioning relation, which is what we've got in the causal case, but maybe it's the coordinated case, which we might have in the case of space, for example. So yeah, I think I have a different argument where, a different paper where I really sort of try and push this point. That is, with respect to transcendental idealism, that is, everybody wants to sort of say that things in themselves ground appearances. And then the question is, well, what do you mean by grounding, right? And people sort of scratch their heads about what the grounding might amount to. And what I argue in that paper is that there is no single thing that grounding means. It's like the conditioning relation. Appearances are causally conditioned, presumably ultimately by things themselves, but they're also compositionally conditioned, presumably in the end also by things themselves, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of different ways in which things themselves are the conditions of conditioned appearances, and it's kind of a mistake to think that there's just one notion of conditioning or grounding that's going to explain all. I mean, in some sense, maybe there is metaphysical dependence, something like that. But then there are going to be a number of much more specific answers to that question, depending on, well, which appearance are you talking about, and in which respect are you asking for the conditions or the thing in itself for what aspect of that appearance. So I just think we need to really focus on the specifics in order to give some somewhat more informative answers than we would give otherwise. Because otherwise we're just saying, well, things in themselves ground appearance just means appearances metaphysically depend on things in themselves. But I sort of already knew that when I said that the one is grounding the other. So you haven't really told me much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Watkins. I have two questions, mainly clarificatory. So the first one is quite simple. So you distinguish between the principle P, PO, and then P totality and P set. So I just want to know more about the difference between PO and P totality. So what more is claimed in P totality that according to your reading, is wrong, but PO is correct? And then I think it's connected with this first one. I want to know what becomes of country marks on transcendental illusion on your reading. So in what sense, if PO is right, in what sense is it transcendental illusion as distinguished from a simply logical illusion or a simple mistake? In what sense is it particularly tenacious, as Kant says, that we cannot really defend ourselves from, we cannot really eradicate this illusion, even we can keep ourselves from being deluded. So what is so particular about this I don't know. So what is particular about this pitfall that qualifies the transcendent illusion?
Okay, good. I'll try to be brief about what the relevant differences are between P all, P totality, and P set. There's a longer part of the paper where I go into that. In some ways, maybe the clearest beginning of an answer is to note that what distinguishes P set from P all is that for P set is really asserting an entity above and beyond the different conditioned members, right? It's P all is just saying if X is conditioned, then Y1, Y2, Y3, and so on and so forth. All of those things exist. P set is saying if X is conditioned, Y1, Y2, and so on and so forth exists, and there's a set. That set exists, right? So in addition to the members of the set, there's the set whose members they are. The problem with that is that if you then say that the set is unconditioned, that's not really what we're looking for. In part, that's actually false, because the set is conditioned by its members, right? A set has its members essentially. And so you can't say that the set is unconditioned if it's conditioned by its members, right? And there's another sort of technical problem, which is that the argument that I sketched, it relied on transitivity. And once you introduce the set, you lose transitivity. So set really doesn't work in the argument, and it has to be false if you accept that the members of a set belong to the set essentially. P totality is murkier, and I don't really like P totality, but Kant does sometimes use the phrase the totality of conditions, and sometimes it can sound like he's objecting to that in some way. And then the question is, well, what do you mean by totality, right? Y1, Y2 taken as a totality. Well, one way of taking it is to say it's a set, right? But we already talked about that. And so another way of taking it is to say that, well, it's one thing for Y1, Y2, Y3, and so on and so forth to exist. It's another thing for us to consider them all together, right? So it's one thing for them to exist. It's another thing for us to conceive of them all together as a totality, right? Now, I'm not quite sure that I fully understand what that means, but it does make things more complicated in the sense that P all is, the most natural way of thinking of it is to think of it as an ontological principle, right? It's saying if one kind of entity exists, then another kind of entity exists. And what P totality is saying, or at least the most natural way of taking it, is to say that if one kind of thing exists, then so do other things, plus a way of conceiving of that, of these other entities, right? But it's hard to understand how that could be plausible, right? That is, it's hard to understand how, because one thing exists, I've got to be able to conceive of something else. This sort of mental dimension to it is really puzzling. And also, again, it looks like the argument doesn't work. And so I don't want to go into the details of that, but maybe that gives you a kind of rough sense of why I'm distinguishing between those and why it is that I favor the very simple P all, right? It's just if X exists, then all of the Y's that condition X also exist. It's not they exist as a set. It's not that they exist as a totality, whatever that might mean. It's just they exist, right? And my intuition is that that just has to be true. And there was the passage that Kant cited, that Kant wrote, where he seemed to be saying that for things themselves. And so I took a lot of took heart from that. So that's at least a beginning of a sort of description of the differences between P all, P totality, and P set. Your second question was about transcendental illusion and what my account of transcendental illusion is. And here I want to say, I guess, two things. One is, at least in the antinomies, Kant seems to suggest that the illusion is not, at least not on my account, it's not that we're accepting the supreme principle, but rather transcendental realism, right? Once we accept transcendental realism, then our troubles are insurmountable, right? Then we get contradictions. So what should we do? I don't think that Kant is suggesting we'll reject the supreme principle, right? Instead, what he's saying, continue to accept the supreme principle, but reject transcendental realism. Okay, so I think that's actually, one further major argument in support of my view, because otherwise, in the antinomies, we would be stuck with, well, both the supreme principle and transcendental realism is false, right? But it seems like a different way of resolving the antinomies is to say, well, if you're going to reject the supreme principle anyway, then you don't have to get rid of transcendental realism. So that's one bit that at least works for the antinomies. It might not work as well for the paralogisms and for the ideal of pure reason, because it's much murkier as to whether they are in some ways assuming transcendental realism in the arguments that they give. That's really not clear. In the case of the ideal of pure reason, Kant starts off with the principle of complete determination, or the principle of thoroughgoing determination, which is different from a merely logical principle. And it's just unclear whether Kant thinks that that is true, whether it presupposes transcendental realism, or what's going on with that. So that's kind of murky territory, I think. So who knows about that? But that's okay, because what I want to say about transcendental illusion is that it's very natural for us to think that because the supreme principle of pure reason is true, and because we're warranted in inferring from the existence of conditioned things that we cognize, because we're warranted in inferring to the conditions, to all the conditions, to the unconditioned condition of that conditioned thing, it's very tempting to think that we can also cognize all of its conditions. After all, when we start off with something conditioned, typically we can cognize at least some of its conditions. And then when we look for more, we find more conditions. So it's very tempting to think that reason wants to cut to the chase and say, okay, let's jump to the unconditioned. And given that I can cognize each of these members of this series, it's very tempting to say that we're going to keep going on in the series until we reach the unconditioned, in which case we're continuing on with cognitions of this. And so it looks like it's at least very tempting to think that we're going to be able to cognize every condition for some conditioned entity, given that the conditions do exist, we're committed to that, and we have had some success as soon as we started looking in attaining cognition of its condition. So what's to keep us from thinking that it's just not going to keep going on like this until we meet with success? So that's at least a sort of quick description of what can seem tempting about the principle, namely, it's tempting to take it to be not just truth preserving, but also cognition preserving. That is, the principle states that it's true that if the condition exists, then it's true that the conditions for it must also exist. So it's truth preserving. And the question is it also cognition preserving? That is, from the fact that I can cognize the conditioned, does it follow that I can cognize its conditions? Tempting to think that it is, but it turns out that it's not, because some of the conditions could be things themselves, and we're never going to cognize them. So it's a great question. It's a hard question. It's a global question. It'd require a lot of work for me really to work it out in detail. So I like the question, and I hope that I've been able to at least sort of point you in the direction that I want to go in.
Can I quickly follow?
Yeah, sure.
So one thing that I remember correctly, that Kant says about transcendent illusion is that we mistake what is merely subjective valid for objective validity. So how do your account accord with this? Do you think it's you're saying the same thing, or do you think you have to do something to accommodate this remark?
Yeah, good. So what I think there is that it's really quite vague what the subjective element is and what the objective element is. But one gloss on that is to say that the subjective element is reason's commitment to SP, right? It's not like we intuit the truth of this. This is just something that reason is committed to. And in that sense, so that is, reason is committed to taking it to be the case that if the condition exists, then so do all of its conditions. That's reason's interest is in pursuing the conditions for all the conditioned objects that are given to us. So that's the subjective side of things, namely P all, and the regulative principles that go along with P all, because reason not only takes it to be the case that if the condition exists, then so do all the conditions, but there are also the regulative principles that if we can cognize some of the conditions, then we ought to be able to cognize its conditions, okay? But that's just subjective. And then what's objective is thinking that we really do have cognition of the unconditioned, right? So we slide from thinking that just because we expect that reality has to be this way and that we can cognize it, that we then all of a sudden can claim that we do cognize it as an objective matter of fact. And well, that's just not true, right? We have the object actually has to be given to us for us to cognize it. So that's the rough lines that I'd want to pursue. Again, that's a really good and hard question, and I would have to say more than I have. I mean, I have to preface all this by saying, in some sense, what this paper rests on, I mean, I think there's one passage where I even said that, it rests on a kind of complete analysis of all the dialectical inferences in the transcendental dialectic, right? I'd have to show that the supreme principle is in fact presupposed in all of them, that it is true, that is, it's truth preserving, but that it's not cognition preserving, right? I'd have to show that for all of the antinomies, all of the paralogisms, and the ideal, right? So I have my work cut out for me. I have a lot to do. And unfortunately, the pandemic did not make me more productive, so I'm not almost done. But I'm working at it. I mean, the one thing I'll say is that it's taken me a long time to sort of get clear about what the different kinds of real conditioning relations are, right? So for example, Kant says that I think is the condition of my representations, right? But what kind of conditioning relation is that, right? He doesn't give definitions. And in fact, it's tempting to think that there are at least 4 different kinds of conditioning relations there, right? Because there's 4 different paralogisms that are all about different subject matters. So it's tempting to say that representations are conditioned in at least 4 different ways. And there are 4 different ways in which I am the condition of those conditioned features. So, you know, he says some things about that, but it's not like it's crystal clear. So I have a lot of work. Yeah, so, but it's interesting.
We have some questions from the audience online, so perhaps we let them to ask their questions.
Sure.
Hi, Eric.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I thank you. Thank you for your readings of paper. I just from your explanation, I've seen some, I'm not sure, some presumed attribute or category attribute of inside the terms of conditioning. It seems that when we're talking about some conditioning relation, we're assuming from a mathematical perspective, a relation which is reflexive and transitive. Is this the, I'm just wondering, are these attributes categorical or categorical to the terms of conditional relation? I mean, because such term seems quite ambiguous to me when I'm talking about different kinds of conditioning. We're talking about composition or causal relation, or sometimes about space and regional spaces. Where so many different ways of talking about conditional relation. So I'm just wondering if is there any way to put some constraints or the minimal constraints to this term?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And though I have a lot of work ahead of me, I also have some work behind me. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what formal features we want to attribute to at least real conditioning relations. I mean, so one question is, to what extent do you want to attribute the same kinds of features to logical conditioning relations that you attribute to real conditioning relations? And then whatever you think about that issue, there's a question of what do you want to say about the formal features of all the different kinds of real conditioning relations? There it looks like transitivity holds at least for composition and for causation, at least as Kant understands it. I know that in the contemporary literature and metaphysics, they typically don't think that causation is going to be transitive, or at least some people think that causation is not going to be transitive, but I think it's pretty clear that Kant does think that it's transitive. But then, like when you get to representation relations, it's very unclear that what transitivity would even mean, right? And so the one that I so in some sense I realized at some point that I don't really want to get too bogged down in trying to identify all the different formal features of all the different real conditioning relations, because well, in some sense there may not be very many. It would be nice if there were, but it may be that in the end we're just stuck with something like explanatory relations of dependence, of metaphysical dependence. I do think that irreflexivity is important. So I think Kant is very clear that nothing can be the condition of itself. In certain, what I wanted to say about transitivity is, so in the argument that I presented, I needed transitivity for the argument to work. And so you might think you're stuck committed to that. But I guess one thought there is to say something like this, which is that if we have series of conditions, then that conditioning relation has to be transitive. But if we don't, then it doesn't, right? So for example, if you've got coordinated conditions rather than subordinated conditions, then you might not need transitivity. And you might be able to launch an argument for the supreme principle of pure reason that worked in that way. I was just picking on subordinated real conditioning relations in formulating the argument because it's more intuitive, I think, than the coordinated case. And it's also true that sometimes when Kant formulates the principle, he formulates it in terms of subordination relations. Though it would be weird if he had one supreme principle of reason for subordination relations and a separate one for coordinated relations. So it would be nice to have one principle of pure reason that encompasses all the different real relations that the reason is in fact interested in. So does that address your concern or your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I should say that you guys need to ask easier questions. So somebody needs to ask me an easy one now. These are all good, hard ones.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, you can ask hard one. It's all right.
Ms. Watkins, at one point you said an infinite series of conditions and condition is itself a unconditioned conditions. Can you say more about that?
Maybe. It's a delicate point precisely because of P set and P totality. If you accepted P set, it would be easier to say how it is that the set of the infinite set of conditions is itself unconditioned, because you could say, well, the set isn't conditioned, right? All the members are conditioned, but the set, which is distinct from the members, can be unconditioned despite the fact that all the conditions, despite the fact that all the conditions are themselves conditioned, right? That would be a great solution to the problem. That is, it'd be much easier to explain the sense in which with an infinite series of conditions, there could still be something unconditioned, namely the set itself or the totality. The problem is that those arguments don't work. And so then I'm stuck with saying, but I think it's legitimate. It's not, I think it's legitimate. And that is, what I want to say is that, so imagine we've got our X, which is conditioned, and the series of Y's condition it. Y1, Y2, Y3, Y4, up to Yn, where Yn is infinite, right? That whole series is itself unconditioned in the sense that none of the members in that series is conditioned by anything that's not a member of the series. Okay, so all the Z's, all the Q's, all the A's, B's, and C's, all those reason can ignore because they are not relevant to explaining the X with which we began. Okay, so insofar as reason is looking for a kind of satisfying resting place, right, which it will find once it has found the unconditioned, once reason has found the series, whether it's finite or infinite, once it's found all of those members, whether it's finite or infinite, it doesn't have to look anymore, right? That's the point of calling it unconditioned. There's no more conditions, and reason to say, finally, I did it, right? Now, of course, there's a problem here, which is that I can't cognize the infinite conditions, the infinite number of conditions of any conditioned thing, right? But that's a problem whether the series is finite or infinite, because Kant thinks that I can't cognize a terminal member either, right? Any appearance that I can cognize is going to be conditioned by some further thing, right? So that's a kind of an issue either way, and is not, in fact, harder for the infinite series. The problem is that people somehow think that, well, I can sort of imagine the terminal member of the series, that's no problem, but I can't really imagine the infinite because it's infinite, it's infinitely long, I'll never get to the end, right? But what does it mean to get to the end? I mean, it can mean one of two things. One is, can I represent the infinite series? And to that, the answer has to be yes, because here I am, I'm talking about the infinite series, right? I have a representation of a series that's not finite, it's infinite. The other thing that one might mean is by saying, can I get to the end, is, can I cognize the infinite members of that series? And there Kant wants to say, well, no, I can't do that, right? But that's a different problem. Again, that's not the ontological problem of, could there not exist an infinite series? There, the problem is that, well, my cognition is limited, but that's the whole point of the first critique anyways, is to make that point. And so that's not really a problem if there are, in fact, an infinite series of conditions. Does that say a little bit more than I said about
Yeah, okay, I see. Thank you.
Okay, it's a good question though.
So can you specify the text which Kant talk about the question?
Well, I did refer to the one passage. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Oops. Yeah, I'm not able to find the passage right now. But I mean, it is kind of interesting if you think about the antinomies. There's the thesis and the antithesis options, and one posits a terminal member, the other says there's an infinite regress, right? And unlike some, Kant does not reject out of hand the idea that there could be an infinite regress. Okay, so ontologically speaking, Kant is not opposed to infinite regresses. This makes him unlike some in the tradition that say, I don't know, other than God, nothing should be infinite. Nothing real should be infinite. I think if that were the case, then Kant would say, we've got a simple solution to the antinomies. Namely, one of the options is fundamentally misguided because it's positing this impossible thing, right? So I think Kant is open to the metaphysical possibility of infinite series. Just a second. Let me just look at the one more passage real quick. I'd given it, now I remember where it, well. Let me see, this was the passage I had in mind. Yeah, so it's the passage at A, this may not be as specific as what you're looking for, but it's the passage at A 417, 18, B 445. This is on, well, you can't see it anymore, so sorry. and it's the passage that says, the absolute whole of the series of conditions for a given conditioned is always unconditioned. And this is the crucial bit, because outside it, there are no more conditions regarding which it could be conditioned. So I take it that this is Kant explaining what it means for something to be unconditioned. All it means is that there are no more conditions of it.
Okay, I got it. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. But if you ask me if I have a second passage that says that, I'm not sure I do. So I want to go back to say, ask the easier questions. That might be the running theme. I don't know.
I have a follow-up question, and I think it's really an easy one. So, and in your justification of the third step of PR, I read this sentence, and you mean that if there is no terminal member, then no condition is unconditioned in the sense that it has no conditions at all. But it is still true that none of these conditions are conditioned by anything that is not a member of the series, and for that reason, they are unconditioned in that sense. I think perhaps you just play a trick here, because as you simply defined what is unconditioned as that is not conditioned and trivial play of words. But actually, perhaps for Kant, and I think for many of his contemporaries and successors, the unconditioned must be a single entity, which something like God or the ego or something, the world as a whole, that serve to somehow unify or serve as an absolute condition of all those conditions. So, for example, when in the famous third antinomy, Kant said either there is a terminal member or there is infinite regress. But his answer is that no, there is a member, but the member is not within the appearance itself. It's like the luminal self. So, but according to what the sentence I just read, it seems that you identified the unconditioned with a whole series of the nature causes and not with the transcendental freedom. So perhaps I'm wrong, but I want more clarification in this case in particular. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Still not an easy question. So you guys are disappointing me terribly here, but that's okay. So what I want to say here is that in the third antinomy, the resolution is, I take it, that if freedom is to be possible, where freedom is a terminal member of the series of causes, if freedom is to be possible, it has to be at the noumenal level, right? But it doesn't follow from the fact that if freedom is to be possible, it has to be at the noumenal level, that therefore there is freedom at the noumenal level. For all I know, there could be an infinite causal series at the noumenal level too, right?
Yes.
So I don't think that Kant would accept that we have to have a terminal member. I think he's just saying, if we have a case of freedom, we have to have a terminal member, but who knows whether we have to have freedom. It's just in the third antinomy, he's worried about, well, maybe natural determinism, that is laws of nature, rule out freedom. It looks like there's a threat, and he wants to eliminate that threat, or at least take away that threat by saying, no, we might be free if we could be free at the level of things themselves. So that's what I would want to say about that part of your question. The other part of your question is Kant, or am I just being a trickster with words when I say that to say that X is unconditioned is to say that it's not conditioned by anything else. I don't think so, because think of moments of time, right? There we've got a series of moments of time where each moment is a condition of the next, right? It's very tempting to say that just as space is infinite in its expanse, so too time is going to go back to infinity. Now, whether there are things in time, that's a separate question, but time itself is going to go back to infinity. And so if each moment in time is a condition of the next, then you might say, well, let's take the current moment in time, right now. How many conditions are there of the current moment in time? Well, we've got a series, and if we were to say there's a first moment in time, then we would have a terminal member. But of course, that's not going to be any good, because then you're going to say, well, what happened? Why did that first moment in time happen then, after a previous moment? So I think that the series of moments in time is going to be infinite. And then you might say, well, that series of temporal conditioning relations, I don't know if it's supposed to be causal or not. That series, that infinite series, is unconditioned. In what sense? Well, it's unconditioned because it's not conditioned by regions in space, for example, right? It's not conditioned by anything that isn't a moment in time, for example. And it's not conditioned by later moments in time. So once I represent that infinite series, starting at now and going back one moment in time, once I do that, once I have a representation of all of those members, which I might grasp under the concept moments prior to now, I know that set, sorry, that total, wait, no, I know that all of those moments in time are unconditioned by any of the things that aren't moments in time. So I think that's a legitimate sense that's informative. God's not conditioning it. I'm not conditioning it. Later moments in time aren't conditioning. There are a lot of things that are not conditioning it. And so reason doesn't have to worry about any of those things. It knows, it's one of these moments in time. If that doesn't work, then Kant and I are both in deep trouble. That's why that's a hard question, by the way.
I have an easy question. Can't distinguish the logical condition and the real condition. I want to know the essential difference between logical dependence and real dependence.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Good. Very good. So yeah, I spent a couple of years thinking about the similarities and differences between real conditioning relations and logical conditioning relations. So I do think that there's a kind of similarity in the sense that they're both explanatory dependence relations, but I think that they're different in several respects. One is that the nature of the dependence is different in each case. In the one, it's logical, and the other, it's metaphysical, or at least ontological, something like that. Another is I think they're going to have different formal features. Because for real conditioning relations, I think that irreflexivity shows that nothing can be the condition of itself. Whereas logically, I think it would be fine to have something that is self-justifying, maybe analytical truths, or I don't know. At least in principle, I can imagine someone saying that's self-explanatory. That proposition is self-explanatory, in which case it's explaining itself. It depends on itself, maybe. And then the third thing that I want to say is that the relata are, I'm going to talk, thanks. I'm fine. the relata are different because real conditioning relations obtain between real entities, whatever, very broadly construed, whereas logical conditioning relations obtain between what Kant calls cognitions or just judgments. So they have very different relata. And in the case of the logical conditioning relations, at least in principle, one can abstract from the relation of those cognitions to the objects. Okay. So that's a kind of start.
Okay. So now I think it's about the time, and please join me to thank again Professor Watkins for very interesting talk and also the answers and Q&A discussions. And